The earliest evidence of human habitation in the region comes from the Meadowcroft site, with archaeologists dating the remains to between 16 and 19,000 years ago. It is possible humans inhabited the region prior, as lower parts of the watershed remained uncovered by previous glacial maxima, but Meadowcroft is the best marker we have. Moving forward, from 11,000 years ago to 4,800 years ago, archaeologists demarcate the Archaic period. In this era, the populations of the region steadily increased, operating in small bands of hunter-gatherers, likely each traveling over territories of 80 to 160 square kilometers. From the end of the Archaic era until roughly 3,000 years before present, the transitional period saw a warmer and drier climate, resulting in less plentiful food. In adaptation, communities tended to traverse less territory and add fishing and gardening to their legacy sustenance strategies. While communities became more sedentary, they also became more connected, with evidence of an extensive trade network in the mid-Atlantic region, likely forming in response to local food scarcities. Within the wider Great Lakes region, scholars characterize 3,000 years ago as the start of the early woodland era. In this period, we find evidence that those living in northeastern North America made regular use of robust ceramics to store and cook food. While they did not practice full-scale agriculture, it appears these communities largely harvested semi-domesticated vegetation including acorns and chenopodium, better known as goosefoot. Both were used to produce flour that likely supported a significant portion of local diets. Around 200 CE, we see a transition into a middle woodland period and the dominance of the Hopewell and Adena cultures of the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lake adjacent areas of western New York. The Hopewell were characterized by increasingly sedentary, stratified, and networked settlements. While their most iconic productions, elaborate earthenwork mounds, are not found in the Allegheny watershed itself, there is strong evidence of existence of cultural interface across the entire basin. Following the decline of the Hopewell, by 1000 CE, we enter the later woodland period. This era is marked by an agricultural revolution sweeping across northern North America. Cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, commonly known as the Three Sisters, began to rapidly increase in intensity and became central to the nutrition of communities across the region. Within this period, we also observe a sharp increase in long-distance trade and evidence of intensified warfare between adjacent communities. Occurring over several centuries, these shifts corresponded to increased political and cultural consolidation. Many scholars hypothesize that this increased segmentation of the region's northern settlements contributed to the diversification of a previously common language system into distinct tongues. Many scholars hypothesize that this increased segmentation of the region's northern settlements contributed to the diversification of a previously common language system into the distinct tongues of Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, and Susquehanna. Zooming back in on the Allegheny River Valley, by the 17th century, the watershed was populated by the Algonquin-speaking Shawnee people and the new political entity known as the Haudenosaunee. These people of the Longhouse, later referred to by Europeans as the Iroquois, comprised a federation of 6 nations, with the Seneca-speaking communities most represented in the upper Allegheny Valley. Neither the Seneca nor their Haudenosaunee allies referred to the Allegheny as the Allegheny. They referred to it as the Ohio, meaning beautiful river, and applied the term to what we now call the Allegheny and Ohio rivers without distinction. Allegheny comes from the Lenape language of the Delaware people, a branch of the Algonquin language family. Just where in the Lenape lexicon, however, remains disputed. Some sources claim the Delaware referred to the people preceding their presence in the valley as the Talagawe, or Allegewi. Some accounts indicate that this may refer to a specific community, while others frame it more as a mythological term. Still others claim the term Allegheny originates from a Delaware translation of the Haudenosaunee beautiful river, Welhakeni, most beautiful stream, with this then being anglicized as Allegheny. Peering back into English language sources, the earliest discussion I could find of the etymology was in the 1780 account of Moravian missionary David Zeisberger. Quote, "All this land and region, stretching as far as the creeks and the waters that flow into the Allegheny, the Delawares called Allegewinek, which means a land into which they came from distant parts. The river itself, however, is called Allegewisipo. The whites have made the Allegheny out of this, the 6 nations calling the river the Ohio." Now, this doesn't add much in the way of clarity, and there is plenty of baggage to unpack from Zeisberger's account, which we will, but it represents the messy nature not only of contemporary sources, but of contemporary actions, namely, the appropriation of land and language in the midst of radical destruction. For the Allegheny River Valley was not the traditional homeland of the Delaware. Historically centered around the mid-Atlantic coastline, they only began inhabiting the Allegheny in the 18th century, displaced westward by the disease-spreading, musket-wielding, name-transmuting founders of the would-be United States of America. When British expansion into North America began in the 17th century, Delaware peoples resided along the, get this, Delaware River. Much of the population was dispossessed, however, after the infamous 1737 walking purchase, where the colonists used runners instead of walkers to claim far more land than initially agreed upon. The land's former inhabitants migrated westward to settle in the upper watershed of the Allegheny, joining several other nations in a dynamic political landscape. By the 1740s, the area was home to the Shawnee and Delaware nations, along with those of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, most notably the Seneca, under the leader of Queen Aliquippa. Trappers and traders of French origin had established enterprises and political ties in the region over the previous decade. As trappers and traders from Britain expanded into the same area, they formed new arrangements with the local nations. The political landscape realigned against French interests. The French responded by building a series of forts. The British began building forts of their own. To reinforce the fort at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the British sent a small military force under the command of one George Washington. By the time he arrived, the partially constructed fort had been seized by the French. The 7 Years' War had begun. Embroiling near all of Europe's great powers, the causes of the conflagration were numerous. The initial spark, however, originated with the rivalry in the Allegheny Basin. Recognizing the significance of this conflict, the indigenous nations of the region began aligning themselves to advance and protect their own interests. The Allegheny was ground zero for the fighting. I won't concern this discussion with the details of the various military campaigns of the war, but I will highlight a few key takeaways. 1. After the war, the French no longer had a major presence in colonial North America. The Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and British were now the political authorities of the Allegheny River. 2. The landscape and communities were scarred by the intense violence. From the massacre of the Delaware at Kittanning to the smoking ruins of Fort Duquesne, the war proved highly destructive. As a result, the 1760s saw renewed expansion of English-speaking colonists and mounting resistance from the region's indigenous nations. The British Crown attempted to honor their agreements with the Haudenosaunee and limit settler expansion west of the Proclamation Line. This line was set along the eastern continental divide. If the water flowed west, it belonged to the Indians. This set the Proclamation Line directly along the boundary of the Allegheny Basin. Despite this action by the Crown, the tide of colonization did not break. Rallying anti-colonial action, an indigenous Great Awakening saw a series of charismatic religious figures and aligned political leaders organize a multinational movement against American encroachment. In April of 1763, nations from across the lower Great Lakes and wider Ohio Valley rose up. This movement was inspired by the prophetic figure Neolin of the Delaware and rallied forces from the Ottawa under Pontiac to the Seneca under Kayokshota. This action was not successful in stemming the tide. The colonial expansion only became more violent. Indeed, in June, the commanding officer at Fort Pitt intentionally provided, in one of the first documented cases, blankets infected with smallpox to Delaware visitors. While unclear if this actually worked, this example demonstrates a clear intent to destabilize and depopulate the communities of the upper Ohio River. This radical expansion was ultimately accommodated by British officials. In 1768, the Proclamation Line was redrawn even further west in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. Signed with the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, this treaty was but one in a long line of land cessions backed by hollow promises. While many of these treaties were quite deceptive, the First Nations of North America weren't hapless fools. In 1776, American officials tried to convince Delaware leaders to come enter into a protection agreement near Fort Pitt. These communities refused. Indigenous people were not passive obstacles. They were decision-makers operating within the geopolitical and social constraints of their time. Constraints that sometimes made these treaties look like the best option, other times not. By 1778, the calculus had shifted. That September, Delaware leaders met with the commissioners of the newly self-declared United States of America at Fort Pitt. They negotiated and signed what became the country's first treaty with its Indian neighbors. To be clear, the Delaware still believed the United States intended to destroy them. Attempts to alleviate this concern by promising the Delaware the potential for statehood were not taken to be genuine. This was common understanding among inhabitants of the Allegheny Basin and well borne out by colonial actions. Remember that missionary David Zeisberger who tried to record the origins of the word Allegheny? According to his diary, his Moravian converts, quote, preferred to stay here in Indian country despite all the wars, because we can see in advance that some harm will be done if we go to the settlements of the white people. Ultimately, the settlements of the white people would come to them. The American War of Independence eroded the last vestiges of the proclamation line. Seeing the British victory as one of the few hopes to protect their future sovereignty, many communities of the wider Ohio Basin began aligning themselves with the British. In March of 1782, a Pennsylvanian militia began an expedition west. After capturing the town of Naughton, the militia massacred 96 Moravian converts, including 32 women and 34 children. While the Naughton massacre didn't occur in the Allegheny Basin, the contingencies precipitating it did. The Allegheny was the gateway to Ohio, and in turn, the rest of the continent. The political machinations and widespread violence that enabled the United States to wrest control of the region and repopulate it with white settlers would be duplicated across the West. Political and economic expansion was non-negotiable, regardless of the continent's human realities. In the word of historian Ben Kierman, United States policies towards Indians did not mandate genocide, but it was practiced when considered necessary. In 1784, perhaps the most significant treaty between the United States and the soon-to-be former inhabitants of the Allegheny Basin went into effect. The Second Treaty of Fort Stanwix formally ceded all territory north of the Allegheny and Ohio rivers. 10 years later, the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua saw the Haudenosaunee and United States arrange yet another displacement. The Seneca Nation, represented by Chief Corn Planter, would be relegated to the land just southeast of Lake Erie, in the northern reaches of the Allegheny Watershed. Now, despite the Americans' best efforts, Indians would remain and persist, but the political order was firmly that of New York and Pennsylvania, rather than Delaware or Haudenosaunee. In April of 1788, one Dr. Hildreth of Marietta, Ohio, passed through a town of just under 500 inhabitants outside the once strategically significant Fort Pitt. By 1810, the population was nearly 5,000. By 1910, over 500,000. In just a century, Pittsburgh had gone from a small outpost to the 8th largest city in the country. What lay behind this rapid growth? In 1789, the cost to send 40 tons of freight 350 miles over land from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was $1,500. The cost to send that same 40 tons 350 miles downriver from Pittsburgh to Louisville was $50. Sitting atop the continent's largest inland waterway and spectacular mineral wealth, the Allegheny River would serve as the vanguard of American industrial expansion. The rains from its smoky skies would usher in a century of radical transformation.